Today we have Gábor Antal, professor of economics, with us to talk about recession and the special qualities, if we can call that qualities, of the COVID-19 recession. Gábor, welcome. It's wonderful to have you with us this morning.
Yeah, thanks for having me for this happy topic.
Yeah, well, there aren't many happy topics nowadays, but there's some important ones, including what's happening right now with the economy, nationally, globally, and so on. And so it's really wonderful to be able to speak to you about this. Let's start our conversation off by talking a little bit about recession and, for that matter, depression. What is a recession for the layman? Could you please explain? And how does it differ from a depression?
Mm-hmm. Well, very simply put, a recession is a decline in economic activity as measured usually by GDP, gross domestic product. So basically everything, all the final goods and services that are produced and provided in a certain economy. Okay, and a recession is a decline in that. So statistically speaking, economists talk about recessions when the growth rate of GDP is negative for 2 consecutive quarters. Okay, so already it's a longer time period, but a depression is an even longer period than that. So basically, a depression is a sustained long recession. Okay, so I could give you an analogy from psychology. Okay, so we all have, we are all in a bad mood sometimes, but then again, we are happy. Okay, so our feelings are cyclical, just like many things in life. So the economy is not an exception. Sometimes there are ups, sometimes there are downs. The downs are recessions. But if that recession, if the bad mood gets prolonged, then for a person it becomes a mental illness, and for the economy it also becomes an illness, and that's what we call a depression. So the same term is not a coincidence. We use that in psychology as well. Okay, and economists also talk about the V shape versus the L shape. Okay, so the V pattern is when there's a downturn, but very soon there's a recovery. That's the V shape. We all hope for that in times of recessions. And on the other hand, the L shape is worse. There's a downturn, and then there's a prolonged stagnation or even negative growth, and that's what we call a depression. We want to avoid.
So tell me a little bit. That's very interesting. Tell me a little bit about the typical causes of, say, a recession, and how this COVID-19 recession that seems to be coming is either similar or differs from typical cases.
So, of course, there are many causes for recessions, and the best way to group them, and how most of the time economists group them, is whether they affect primarily the supply side of the economy, so production and output, or the demand side of the economy. So they are even called supply side shocks versus demand side shocks. Okay, the supply side shocks are, for example, a big natural disaster that destroys facilities, production facilities in an economy, disrupts supply chains. A war that is waged on domestically within the borders is also an option. An exchange rate crisis that increases import prices, or an oil price shock. So any external price shocks are the types of supply side shocks that first they affect supply, and of course later on they will have an effect on demand, but more on that in a second. So the other causes are demand related. Okay, so GDP, gross domestic product, is purchased in 4 ways. So all the goods and services produced in an economy can be purchased in 4 major ways, the components of GDP. They can be consumed by households. There is investment demand by companies for capital goods. The government can purchase goods and services. And finally, the rest of the world can purchase our domestically produced goods and services, which is exports. So any of those components, if they are affected by a shock, then GDP will be affected as well. Okay, so so for example, if there's a downturn in a major trading partner, like for Hungary, Germany is a major trading partner. So if there's a recession there, then that will affect through exports Hungarian GDP as well. That's a demand side shock. Or if there's fiscal austerity, so the government is either increasing taxes, decreasing social transfers, or decreasing its direct purchases of locally made goods and services, that is also a shock to demand. Or a financial crisis like in 2008 or in 1929, the collapse of the stock exchange. So a financial crisis can have real effects, can have effects in the real economy. That's also a demand side effect. Okay, and what's very important is that sooner or later everything gets everything will be a demand side effect through the multiplier effect, which was proposed by John Maynard Keynes. So the multiplier effect is a spiraling effect, whatever the start of the recession, because output declines, income declines, so income of people declines, and then consumption further declines. That means that output further declines, and so on and so forth. So there's a chain reaction of events. So essentially, at the end of the day, every recession gets a demand side recession through the multiplier effect, but the initial cost can be supply side cost or a demand side cost.
I see. So what's
COVID.
Yeah. So what's unique about our unfortunate COVID-19 situation, in your view?
Yeah. So a pandemic or any epidemic is special, in my opinion, in a sense that it's at the same time a supply side factor and a demand side factor. So basically, and it's not like, so a regular recession, what happens is there's a gradual decline in demand, or there's a gradual decline in supply, and it's the magnitude is, so for example, in the financial crisis, the recent financial crisis, let's say economic activity declined by 10 to 20%, and so on and so forth, gradually. But during an epidemic, complete sectors are basically shut down. Like they go down to zero. Activity goes down to zero. So both production and purchases are stopped. So both supply and demand is stopped in many sectors. So it means that that both demand and supply is down in the short run, and then in the long run, it causes serious troubles, like the supply chains of companies are disrupted. There will be a drop in income for many people, the drop in income for firms and households, which through the multiplier effect will cause further troubles. And then, of course, the most important part is uncertainty, which has a very long run effect. So if there is uncertainty, then people, and both people and firms, they don't want to spend. They don't want to engage. They don't dare to engage in long run projects. So that further cuts spending and demand, which through the multiplier effect again strengthens this chain reaction in the economy.
I see. So we have a sort of a recession, or a coming recession, with multiple causes in a certain classic sense. I'm curious then, what would be a typical response at a macro level to a recession? And then what do you anticipate happening now as governments react to the downturn in the economy?
So the typical reaction is, first you would like to fight the cause of the recession, if it's possible, right? So if there's a natural disaster, then it's already impossible to fight the cause because it has happened. But if it's possible, you want to fight the cause, and then you try to restore demand, right? So because you try to stop this multiplier effect happening, and this chain reaction to go on and on. And this, as proposed by Keynes during the Great Depression, so if there's a lack of private demand, then the government should step in and create demand in the economy, so generate demand in the economy. So that's the classic response to a business cycle type of to a shorter recession.
Mm-hmm.
And how, so the policy tools for creating more demand can be either of a fiscal nature or of a monetary nature. Okay, so there can be fiscal expansion in three ways, basically: decreasing taxes, increasing transfers, or increasing direct purchases of goods and services by the government. Mm-hmm. So building infrastructure, spending on public goods and services, etc. The other way, the other set of economic policy tools are of a monetary nature. So monetary easing can be a response essentially in two ways: decreasing the central interest rate, which is many central banks are doing during a crisis, mm-hmm. Or increasing the money supply, so increasing the amount of money circulating in the economy, which enhances demand. Okay, so these are the typical responses. Now, a pandemic is different from that. So in a sense that the first thing you have to do is a medical response. Okay, so health is first. And it's not only a humanitarian aspect here, it's also an economic aspect, because if you have, so if you let this virus go unmitigated, then you know, having hundreds of thousands of deaths and people in hospitals, or even millions, that has serious economic costs, okay? Because those people mm-hmm. cannot produce, they cannot demand, so that itself is a big shock to the economy, or would be a big shock to the economy. So it's not only a health shock, it's also an economic shock. So mm-hmm. you want to avoid that. That's the first thing, and all countries realize that pretty much. That's the first thing to do, you know, flattening that curve, right. As many people talk about that. Okay, and then once you manage to do that, then you can have economic responses. So because it's not a typical crisis, pursuing demand side policies is not very useful at the moment, mm-hmm. because people are not allowed to consume apart from, you know, online purchases and necessities. So what you would like to do is, so for most people and companies, the revenue and expense balance is screwed up now, right? So revenues are down, but you still have your expenses ticking, and the clock is ticking in terms of spending and expenses. So you should try, I mean, not you, the government should try to restore that balance mm-hmm. as far as possible. And so how can you do that? Well, you can suspend the repayment of loans, moratorium on, mm-hmm. on loans, mortgages, or other loans. Then you can prolong social transfers like maternity leave, so that people have at least that kind of revenue. The government in many countries is considering to pay salaries instead of companies for employees to mm-hmm. keep them, mm-hmm. Which is pretty much unprecedented. So governments might pay up to 70–80% of the wages for eligible companies and eligible employees. Then you know, bridge loans are given to companies in trouble. Then taxes, that there is a suspension of paying taxes, paying social contributions for both employers and employees. Okay, so basically many measures that somehow try to stop the clock on your expenses, mm-hmm. Or help you get some revenue to you know, to not to go bankrupt, because like mass bankruptcies of both households and companies are something that can lead to a depression in the long run. So you want to avoid that. And then once you have this, and once life returns to normal, more or less, then come the regular demand side policies, expansionary policies. So once production and demand is restored to some extent, then the government can boost demand even further to get the economy out of this slump as fast as possible. Okay, but until then, you have to help both people and companies survive this lockdown.
It's remarkable. And I really wonder now, for example, given what you're saying, I mean, this pandemic that we're now witnessing is really disruptive. And I noticed you said, for example, that supply chains are being disrupted. Many industries, many sectors of the economy are simply shut down. So this is nothing like 2008 in that regard. It's something very different. And so I wonder if you could say a word about the sort of mindset, the sort of things our students who are going to graduate might have in mind. You know, there's some of the things they might think about as they finish their studies. This seems like a really foreboding time to do that, but such is the reality for many students around the world, including some McDaniel students. What might you say to someone who's shortly to be on the job market or thinking about graduate school, these sorts of things?
Well, of course, the major factor here in this crisis is uncertainty. So nobody really knows anything. So we don't know much about the behavior of the virus. We don't know much about our immune system's responses to that. We don't know much about potential immunity after being infected and you know, after a recovery. So there are a lot of question marks, and most people have not experienced anything like that, because the last such pandemic was in 1918 and 19, the Spanish flu epidemic. So most people, you know, who are alive now today have not experienced that. So it's hard to say what the future will bring, but there are some tendencies. So for sure, there will be a loose job market. So for those students who graduate, they will probably find it hard to find a job. Although, you know, some good news are there. So home office and working from home, what we are doing right now, helps, right? So and most graduate students will probably look for a job where home office is an option. Okay, so in those jobs will be probably easier to find than, let's say, you know, jobs in catering or event management and sectors, travel, that they are most heavily affected. So, but they have to prepare for a longer job search process. You know, do whatever they can to expand their skill set, to be more prepared, to be the best candidates for the jobs, because the competition will be harsh for those jobs. There will be many unemployed people. Then another thing to do is, because of the uncertainty, and because one lesson of this crisis is that, you know, like in 2 weeks, life can change dramatically, and if you don't have savings, if you don't have financial reserves, then you won't survive. So I suggest students to build up financial reserves, cash, liquidity reserves, because these epidemics will probably get more frequent. At least that's what experts are saying, and because of the uncertainty that the future is bringing, it's good to be prepared and have a good amount, so a few months of savings on which you can rely on in terms of in times of emergency. Okay, and what, of course, some personal facts, they might expect some shortages in certain products, goods and services. There will be limited access to certain goods and services. You know, travel will not resume for a while. I mean, at least international travel will be limited. So your favorite bar, cafe, pub might close forever. You know, there might be fewer events, sports events, concerts, festivals. Stronger checks and stronger surveillance is expected by the state. For sure. So even the state might require, you know, taking your temperature, taking tests, following you up with the help of your mobile data, cell data. So yeah, and also probably prices might increase in the long run, because, you know, this crisis will probably put a halt to globalization. And a big reason for low prices and low inflation in the recent period was globalization. That you know, firms managed to outsource their activities into low wage countries, and efficiency was driving all the global supply chains. So that will now change probably, and there will be some relocalization, and that will increase prices in the long run, I guess. But, you know, these are just predictions at the moment.
Right. Like you said, this the one of the major characteristics of all of this is the extremely high level of uncertainty, and the great lack of data, of information that we can even begin to make predictions with. Right. So I recall the conversation that I had last week with Luis Murillo, and one thing he said, thinking more about the psychology of the situation, is, remember, this crisis is not your fault. It's not your personal responsibility. So here again, the strange and difficult economy that graduating students will face is not their personal responsibility. Of course, nevertheless, they will have to each respond carefully to the situation as best they can. Well, thank you very much, Gábor, for your time today. This has been a fascinating conversation, and I think I understand much better the basic conditions of a recession and why we're seeing one now. Any closing thoughts?
Well, nothing really. I can join your thoughts about personal responsibility, and just in that, yeah, the crisis is not your personal responsibility. The responses that you give to the crisis personally, that's, well, you know, it's in the term responsibility. Right. So we still have the ability to respond to this crisis well, and what I see is that governments do a lot to respond well to this crisis. Of course, you know, they are inventing things on the go, because it's so unprecedented. But they are a lot. You know, we see enormous economic packages in the United States, in Europe, everywhere. So unprecedented economic packages to help the economy, but also at a personal level. You should, I mean, of course, you should do anything you can to stop the spread of the virus, but then you should do whatever you can to get the economy going again. And, you know, there's just a final thought. There's a bit of a paradox here, because what I said before, you have to save, you have to build reserves, although to some extent it's already too late for some to start building reserves now or saving. But, you know, increasing your savings is not good for the economy, because what you would like to do to get the economy going again is to increase consumption. And if you increase savings, then consumption decreases. So there's a little paradox here between individual optimization and social optimization. So what I suggest is try to save, but also do anything you can to support other businesses and other people. So if you manage, then try to keep up spending on things that you buy, that you purchase, to help whatever business units to survive this crisis. Because the more units survive, the less likely it will be that we get into a depression, which is bad for everyone. So so you have to find a balance between not cutting your consumption drastically, but still, thinking about your future in terms of savings.
Right. Well, let's hope that the macro policies of governments help us achieve that kind of balance. Thank you very much, Gábor, and
Thank you.
I hope to join you again later this semester with more conversations about today's economy. All the best.
All the best to you, Matt. Bye.
Thank you.